Okay, I think we'll get started. Welcome everyone to our session on human rights in Asia here at the Jeju Forum on Peace and Prosperity. I'm John Delury of Yonsei University, and I'll be serving as the moderator. I'm honored, I'm humbled to share the stage with this group, as will be very obvious as we get into discussion. I'm no expert on human rights, but I have been involved in a project with some of the panelists and have been studying these issues, and hopefully it can fulfill my role, which is to ask the questions, the stupid questions, the easy questions, the difficult questions, and also to bring you into the conversation so that everyone here who has a question, who has a thought, can share it. So it's, again, a real honor. I'm looking back up here just to make sure that we have our virtual participant, so hopefully she will appear. I think I see her there. So I think we're all set to get started. So let me just briefly introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to turn it right over to them, and we'll kind of start with a round of 5 or 7 minute set pieces that will get the conversation going. And I'll ask them to speak in the order here, and then we'll hear last from Professor Caballero Anthony, who's with us virtually. So to my immediate left is Rehan Assad. She is a human rights lawyer, a Yale Law School fellow and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. She flew from London. I think she's spending her time in the UK these days. And Rehan is one of, I think she would insist on one of, the most important voices in the world, drawing attention to, and speaking very thoughtfully and very impactfully on the issue of the Uyghur minority in China and what's happening with Uyghurs and others in Xinjiang, an issue that I think everyone's at least vaguely familiar with, but we're extremely lucky to have her in person and to learn from her insights and to hear her call to action on that issue in particular, and general issues of human rights and international law that she is expert on. And then next is Maiko Ichihara, professor in the Graduate School of Law, so we have a law theme, and School of International and Public Policy. She's also assistant vice president for international affairs, which explains why she's so busy, at Hitotsubashi University in Japan. And Professor Ichihara does fascinating work on democracy, I think the political side of human rights. We can hear from her in particular, transnational repression and coercion, and how democracies can fight back across the Asia region. So she's based in Japan, but she has quite a bit of geographic breadth that she can share with us, the insights. And Hannah Song, there at the end, is Director of International Cooperation and researcher at a very important Seoul-based organization, we all know it here in South Korea, a North Korean human rights NGO called the Database Center for North Korean Human Rights, or just NKDB. Everyone says NKDB. And I certainly look forward to, I think it's annually, this big report on North Korean human rights. A very important and thoroughly researched report arrives at my office, and that's thanks to her work and her colleagues there. So she is a font of wealth of information on the North Korean human rights issue, and so we'll be able to get into that. And finally, we have virtually, there she is, Professor Meli Caballero Anthony, Professor of International Relations, who holds the President's Chair for International Relations and Security Studies, and is head of the Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, and I believe she's joining us from Singapore. So welcome, Professor Caballero Anthony. Can you just confirm you can hear us? You're nodding your head, so that's a good sign. Are you there? Great, thumbs up. Okay, wonderful. And so I'll ask you to clean up and go last. So let's get it started, and we can just hear your thoughts on the broad issues of human rights, dilemmas, and solutions in Asia. And Rehan, if we can start with you.
Can you hear me? Yeah? All right. 안녕하세요. I'm very delighted to be here. That's the extent of my Korean. When we talk about human rights in Asia, we tend to put all these countries and lump them together, but Asia is obviously a bloc comprised of many different countries with different sets of values. We have countries like South Korea, which is a leading democracy. Equally, there are many authoritarian countries in the regional bloc that has been using human rights as a Western construct that runs counter to Asian values to commit and perpetuate human rights abuses against their vulnerable population. So we must acknowledge the diverse nature of the regional bloc to begin with. The theme of the conference is to work together to create sustainable peace and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific region. I read the South Korea government's new strategy to achieve that goal, and I'm heartened to see human rights seem to take the center stage in their vision to working together with like-minded countries to achieve this goal about peace and prosperity. And as a human rights lawyer, I fundamentally believe that human rights has to be part of that solution. Without the human rights, we cannot achieve neither peace nor prosperity. So in that regard, I want to bring up this issue of the role of Asia in general and other countries when state violence is committed by superpower perpetrators or countries with military, nuclear, and economic capabilities, which often renders victims with few avenues of justice and accountability. As John mentioned, I am myself a human rights lawyer of Uyghur heritage, and I work on the issue of the mass persecution of the Uyghurs, which the United Nations concluded that last year, that China is committing an international crime, in particular crimes against humanity. It falls short of determining genocide, but while highlighting that the Chinese government did commit forced sterilization against women of childbearing age. So the conference second theme focuses on dilemma. And I want to talk about why we put these different topics together, human rights, dilemma, and the solution. Oftentimes, countries are reluctant or hesitant to bring up about human rights concerns. We live in a very interconnected world, and that is a result of globalization. Our economy is very much interconnected. Global collaboration is very much necessary to handle or resolve issues concerning whether it's a global pandemic or a climate change agenda. But that doesn't mean that we have to forsake human rights in these areas of collaborations. I think one needs to acknowledge that the globalization led to the ultra-rich Western corporations to become even richer than before, while I don't deny the average citizens did benefit from the economic prosperity as a result of globalization, but at the same time, it did marginalize many populations, including my own community. As a result of this, economists at Oxford, leading economists, Kate Roberts, start talking about that we need to create a circular or regenerative economy that includes every population, especially those vulnerable, and achieve our climate justice agenda. And the second dilemma that I want to talk about is this climate change issue. Oftentimes, as somebody who's working on this issue, I do believe that we need to collaborate with China, despite it is cooperate with China, despite it is a superpower perpetrator on issues concerning climate justice. But climate change, and I keep using the term climate justice, climate change is a human rights issue. And I think we need to frame it as climate justice. At the moment, the vast majority of solar panel components are produced in China, especially in the Uyghur region. And the enslaved Uyghurs are producing the solar panel products that are tainting the global supply chain. That means human rights and climate change, these are interrelated issues. We cannot separate them and address them separately. This November, for example, the United States blocked more than 1,000 shipments of solar panel with hundreds of millions of dollars that tainted this solar panel. And I just want to give this anecdote as a fact to linger in the room and let us think about this interconnectedness that I'm talking about. Every country, including China, has to be a responsible stakeholder. This entails upholding the basic human rights values. That means refraining from committing genocide and crimes against humanity or egregious human rights abuses against any person, and especially vulnerable population. And the third dilemma is that I want to very briefly touch on is it's been very difficult to hold superpower perpetrators accountable for human rights. Many UN member states are more willing to talk about human rights issues committed against smaller countries, but not so much so when it's committed by powerful countries. Or we also have seen that businesses tend to uphold the values of ethical principles when it comes to in smaller countries, but not so, again, in superpower countries, whether it's in Russia or China. So I think this is very important to highlight that all these issues that we have tried to separate, the economy, the state of our planet, it's a affliction of climate change and the scourge of human rights abuses have been constant, seem to actually very much spill and seep into each other. And we realize, perhaps, I hope, like after this brief intro, that we may have displaced the dilemma that we are often raising up in our global discussions. I think that when we do separate these issues, it creates a culture of impunity for perpetrators, and the world would be left with grappling with more human rights abuses and also potential conflict. And if human rights violations have, one thing I really want to highlight is that human rights violations often have a boomerang effect. Myanmar is a great example of that. When the atrocities against Rohingya community are committed, the vast majority of population stood by silently, but look at where things are now. The military took over, and that is the boomerang effect of human rights violations. And I want to end on a more positive note. If human rights violations have boomerang effect, so is the victory of one oppressed group. Because it's not just a triumph of justice for that particular group, but rather a collective triumph that resonates with all of us, but also elevates the entire human rights standards. When the Rohingya community brought a very successful case in the ICC under very novel precedent, under very novel legal theory, it set a new precedent for victims and lawyers and activists to use that as a precedent to push for change. Now, because of that precedent, Uyghur groups filed a case before the International Criminal Court, so is the Syrians as well. And that is the boomerang effect of human rights inspirational stories where we can push the boundaries of the international law. So I don't want people to see Asia as a continent or rather just where human rights atrocities are happening, but also really revolutionary creative ideas are happening in terms of setting a new legal precedent for the entire world. And that is the beauty of Asia. And I think, so that brings me to ultimate final angle of this focus
you
is
get
the solutions.
To talk after this, this
so
opening.
Which means that we need to empower all the human rights oppressed group, victims, and lawyers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think you all blur the distinction, but we have a little bit of a shift from activist to academic. I don't know which is worse in terms of time management or more difficult, but no, please go ahead, Maiko, and join the conversation.
Thank you very much, John, for your introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. I'm really honored to participate in this Jeju Forum today. Well, apparently Rayhan has a lot to talk, so I'm really happy to shorten my initial remarks. Well, living in the Northeast Asian side of Asia, I think many of us tend to forget how the human rights situation in Asia as a whole has been pretty problematic, especially in Southeast Asia and South Asia, I would say. Well, compared to Northeast Asia, where relative accountability and transparency have been maintained, even during the pandemic, where, for example, South Korean government and Taiwanese government placed importance on accountability, and so had, explaining sessions every day on what's going on with the COVID cases and what kind of countermeasures are taken, and also where Japanese government placed importance on the human rights protection so that they did not implement curfew or many of the restrictions on civil liberties. South Asia and Southeast Asia are really, really terrible, even amongst democratic countries in terms of human rights violation. Let me bring some examples which were shown during the pandemic. One of the things that was seen during the pandemic was the concentration of power in the government. For example, the Malaysian government terminated the parliament in order to implement policies on their own without objections. And the Indonesian government also did very similar thing of basically creating COVID-related countermeasures without allowing objections from the legislature. And then also the sanction measures against those who violate curfew was very harsh in some of the countries, which include India, where people who violated curfew were beaten up on the streets, and in the Philippines, where violators were put into dog cages. And also those anti-fake news laws were created during the pandemic in the pretext that fake news related to COVID had to be restrained. But in reality, those governments used the anti-fake news laws to suppress journalists in those countries. And so those domestic aspects of human rights, apparently those egregious human rights violations in non-democratic countries such as China, Myanmar, Thailand, what have you, has been very, substantial and serious, including in India, where the, suppression of freedom of speech is pretty harsh. But even in democratic countries, the human rights violations has been pretty serious. And so those are domestic situations. And on top of that, there's this international aspect, as Rayhan was also talking about, of authoritarian influence operations going on. Discursive wars are happening. And then especially China and Russia has been cooperating very much to spread, to sort of undermine and destabilize democratic societies by damaging some of the legitimate concepts which is related to liberal democracies, such as human rights, democracy, and elections. And so we are in an era where we have to tackle both domestic populists who undermine human rights in those countries, as well as those international authoritarian actors, which actually causes a synergy between them.
Great, thank you, Maiko. You did offer some bonus time. And both of you have raised a number of really important issues that we'll be circling back to. So Hannah, how about you next, please?
Great. Thanks, Professor Delury. On that, you mentioned we have a spectrum of activists and academics. I think I'm more on the activist side, working at a small nonprofit in Seoul. But what I wanted to open up with links quite nicely to what Professor Ichihara was talking about in terms of how COVID has affected the human rights of, for me especially, the North Korean people. We all were quite excited to hear, I'm sure, on May 5th when the WHO announced that COVID-19 is no longer a global health emergency. But I think many people forget that for one country, it still very much remains a health emergency. One country still remains as isolated as ever. They are still stuck in time. Few people are going in, few people are coming out. The Database Center for North Korean Human Rights, NKDB, the organization that I am working for, like many of us, rely heavily on the people who are able to leave North Korea and speak freely about a country which the government, quite frankly, does not. Since we were established in 2003, we have relied heavily on North Korean escapees. Some will refer to them as defectors, some refer to them as refugees. I prefer a more neutral term, escapees. And they were, during the peak of what you call the Great Famine, we had people up until the 2000s coming to South Korea, escaping North Korea. But during the pandemic, we had last year 67, the year before less than 70, and we are not expecting the numbers to increase much more, even as the whole world opens up their borders. And we all know that the North Korean government's oppression and violation of the human rights of the people has been a cause for concern for many years. It's been 75 years of a totalitarian government, 75 years when, at the same time, the UN will be celebrating the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's the exactly same amount of time that North Korea has maintained totalitarian control over their people. It's also been 10 years since the United Nations commissioned an investigative body to investigate the human rights violations that are occurring in North Korea, and they concluded that crimes against humanity are occurring in North Korea. But what has been done since then? Since the establishment of my organization, we've recorded over 130,000 entries in our database related to human rights violations. Yet, unfortunately, the human rights violations occur, and during COVID, many experts are calling this the new dark ages. While just because we hear little about what is happening in North Korea does not mean nothing is happening. In December 2020, the North Korean government enacted what is known as the Anti-Reactionary Thought and Culture Law. While I'm sure many of us here, and I know the South Korean government, are really, cashing in on the Korean wave that is taking the world by storm, the North Korean government is taking the exact opposite response. Watching a South Korean movie, listening to South Korean songs, speaking in a South Korean dialect will lead to young students being imprisoned and taken away to political prison camps. But as we, confront these dilemmas, I think that doesn't mean there isn't hope for what we can do moving forward. Yes, there are a few North Koreans that are coming out, but there are 34,000 survivors who are living in South Korea, 34,000 North Korean escapees who can be empowered, who we can engage in to be, the voices of the North Korean people whose voices are oppressed by their very own government. We can also remember that this is not just a North Korean issue. I think when we talk about North Korea, many people quite frankly give out quite a big sigh because what can be done with North Korea? But there are different avenues in which we can approach the issue. China has come up several times already even in the introductory remarks of my fellow panelists, but there are thousands of North Koreans in hiding in China at this very moment. China does not recognize North Koreans as refugees. They're seen as illegal economic migrants, and they are they are the victims of China's extreme surveillance laws that expanded during the COVID-19 pandemic as well. Yet these very few reports or information are coming out about these vulnerable groups in China as well. And I think we can look for areas in which we can continue to engage the North Korean government as well. The North Korean government has chosen to isolate itself and done more damage to its country more than any international sanctions could ever do. But at the same time, there are avenues for dialogue. Climate change has already been brought up. North Korea has shown that they are willing to talk about climate change. And we can't dismiss, as has already been raised, that climate change, climate justice is also a human rights issue that we can be talking to North Korea about. We have to remind them that they are a UN member state. They have international values that they need to be upholding. I've been hearing a lot of discouragement from my fellow activists, academics, people working in the North Korea space because of how little information is being coming out of North Korea. But I think this is a good opportunity for all of us to take a step back and evaluate what we have done for the past few decades on North Korea when no diplomats are going into the country, when no humanitarian agencies are being allowed into the country, when the borders do open up, and I do believe that they will. What can we do differently to ensure that the policies that different governments are making ensure that it's the North Korean people that is at the center of all of them? Again, there were so many points that my panelists in front of me mentioned that I'm sure we can go into a little bit more detail, but I'll try to keep my time and leave it there. Thanks, John.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hannah. Let's go to you, Melly. The volume's soft. I don't know if it's on our end or yours.
Okay, I think we had a test earlier. Yeah, all right. Yeah. So let me first thank the organizers for inviting me to join this panel. And my apologies that I cannot be there in person. This is now that the borders have opened, there's a lot of activities that are happening because conferences are being organized in many parts of Southeast Asia, and especially here in Singapore. So anyway, I'll do what I can in this current circumstances. There were a number of questions that the chair has given to us, but let me just confine my comments on the state of human rights protection during a very consequential period in recent history. And what I mean by that is what the state of human rights during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I apologize to Maiko if I repeat some of the points that she's already mentioned. But in the context of understanding or perhaps having a better grasp of the dilemmas faced by states and other actors in dealing with such a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic, there's always the dilemma of the extent to which you want to protect your population from being able to be, from the threat of a very contagious and to a certain extent virulent pandemic, even especially before the vaccines were actually produced and other antivirals. And so the dilemma of protecting and at the same time ensuring that the other human rights, right? It's not just the health, the health security is protected, but that you're able to also being able to enjoy, right, some of the rights that you have, even during times of what we call humanitarian emergencies, because the pandemic, COVID-19, a pandemic has been termed as a public health emergency of international concern. And as we have seen over the last, almost 3 years, that the pandemic was more than just a global health crisis. It really affected all states, regardless of your geography and economic status. You can have the most powerful and some of the richest countries in the world, right? And they were not immune from the spread of the pandemic. And you also had the poorest of the poor countries that were clearly very much disadvantaged as a result of COVID-19. And that this pandemic also became a very huge economic crisis. Many of the economists in this world would say that, in between 2020 to 2021, at least, I think the world has experienced the worst recession that has not been seen since the 1930s global recession. So you have these two very stark dimension of the impact of the pandemic. So how did it affect human rights? Now, rights in this instance is very broad, from the political and civil rights to the economic and social rights. So amongst the impact of the pandemic was really the increase in insecurity, economic security, especially among the poor and marginalized sectors. I think the ADB has talked about, again, in the last 2 years, 10 million people across the world, especially Asia, had actually fallen into poverty line. That means you suddenly have another 10 million people becoming very poor, living on less than $2 a day. And then you had populations or communities that have been extraordinarily displaced. And I'm talking about the migrant populations across the world, right? Especially in our part of the world, in Asia, where they, because of the pandemic, they lost their jobs. They couldn't go back to their own countries. And when they went back to their own countries, right, some of them were not allowed to come back, right? So, and there were also increased incidents of hate speech and discrimination against ethnic and minority groups. The health scholars will talk about the geographicalization, something like geography of diseases, because suddenly if you are of Chinese looking, then they'll say that you are the cause of, that you bring with you the virus. And it's very difficult, especially if you live in a multi-ethnic society. All of this can then, there was the concern that it was going to trigger, and in fact, it triggered a lot of hate speech and a lot of discrimination. Thirdly, I think amongst the many communities that have been impacted and whose rights were really seriously affected were women, a lot of women. It exacerbated the vulnerabilities of women to domestic violence. There's a long reports of how much domestic violence had increased as a result of the pandemic, because partners decided to vent their anger or frustration on the wives, and the wives also took on a lot of work and responsibilities. And yet, many of them have also lost their jobs. There was a lot of economic deprivation as a result of loss of employment. And the other communities that had suffered tremendously are really those that, in the context of the region, a lot of refugees, asylum seekers, and even those internally displaced persons in conflict-affected areas. So that was if you talk, the swathe of groups and communities and the kind of issues that many faced. So one could also see, on the one hand, how governments had responded to this. Many governments in East Asia had responded in various ways. And again, I think, to give them the benefit of the doubt, the concern was really how to protect the population from getting infected. So they closed their borders. They restricted the arrival of the returning residents. You saw some even in Australia, for example, some of their own residents who went overseas, regardless of whether they're Caucasians, they're Australians, or of different ethnic origin, they couldn't come back because the borders were closed. There were a lot of emergency measures that were being also introduced within states. The restriction in the movements of people. And at the same time, for those governments whose pockets were much deeper, there was a lot of short to medium term, assistance provided to those that were economically displaced. But really, if you talk about this extent of the human rights, the impact of the human rights, of communities as a result of health measures, is really, you can see that most in countries that are facing a lot of challenges, particularly those that are also facing internal conflicts. And I think Michael talked about the case in Myanmar. The military coup in Myanmar happened just a year after the pandemic, at the time when the impact was just beginning to unfold, so to speak, in terms of you can really see how much damage has been done as a result of the pandemic. And yet, right, because of the coup, it exacerbated further the crises that many communities have faced, because in order to crack down on civilians that were protesting, they were denied access to medical services, and some of those people in the medical services, because they were seen to be against the junta, were also not even allowed, and some of them fled. So as a result of that, the level of services, medical services in Myanmar really, really dropped. So, but on the other hand, right, there were also those, that in spite of certain states, that in spite of the fact that governments really tried their best to protect their people, there were some communities that fell through the cracks. And you're talking about, again, migrant workers. We had a study that we did in partnership with other researchers across Southeast Asia and East Asia. So we had from Indonesia, from Philippines, Myanmar, and then in Northeast Asia, we had Japan and China. And even in a place like Japan, where there's obviously better measures were adopted, there actually, according to one of the reports, the emergence of new vulnerable communities whose rights were actually not were ignored, or again, were taken for granted, perhaps as a result of the preoccupation of governments to deal with what is immediate. And these are the rights of elderly population, right, who could not, for example, they didn't have the means to go out and to get themselves to have health access. And the same trend could be seen even in places like China, where even the old people cannot, because of the lockdown, unlike young people who are able to cope and were able to use technology, right? These old people, these new so-called new vulnerable communities were actually very much impacted. And migrant workers who couldn't understand language, most of the announcements were done in Chinese, or they were done in Japanese or in Koreans. Some of the migrant workers couldn't understand what was happening, so they themselves had to fend, right, and just to depend on each other in coping with the state during that state of emergency. So the long and short is that while you do have, right, you already have countries that have problems with the protection of human rights of their own communities. One, in times of humanitarian crises, like what we saw in the pandemic, those insecurities have actually magnified and aggravated. And in vulnerable settings, in conflict settings, you do have now the risk of this getting even worse and can trigger certain societal conflicts, and where before this so-called societal tensions could have really been managed. And that was really the fear that a lot of, whether it is government officials or NGOs or activists, were very worried that in certain settings, right, when the layer of this, where hate speech comes, aggravated because of social media and etc., then you could really have what we call hotspots, right, or just, very, 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 very sensitive or very dangerous situations where conflict could just actually arise. And there were images of what happened in the past when you are not able to manage this. And it actually also led to the perpetuation of many abuses. Then you could have really a very dangerous situation. So I guess looking back, when you think
Melly,
about...
if you could wrap up. Sorry, we're at time, yeah.
I will write up, yeah. So I guess moving on, there are a lot of things we can think about, maybe in the discussion, as to how we can then manage this kind of challenges and protect human rights, particularly in times of humanitarian emergencies. Thank you. Apologies for speaking a bit too long. Yeah.
No, I apologize. I hate to have to cut any of you off. And there's an incredible, there's kind of a feast of topics here and a lot of cross-cutting themes. Maybe one way to start is to sort of pull out Rehan and Hannah. I think it would be interesting to try to get the two of you, and feel free to ask questions of one another and engage in dialogue, because I think in a way it's interesting to think about these two particular, Melly uses this phrase, human rights atrocities, which I certainly think we can apply to the Uyghur case, which of course has a long history behind it, but also has moved into this horrible phase that we're still in. And then Hannah, as you described it, the North Korea issue is sort of been around for so long that almost part of the problem, right, in terms of activism is the fatalism about all issues, North Korean, the nuclear issue, but also the human rights issue. I wonder if we can try to put these two issues into a kind of focus and even see if there are some overlaps there, even though on the surface they're different. And maybe the way I would try to ask it to really pull you out, as activists, as people who are out there in the world, including coming here, really trying to generate change and progress on these issues or stop horrible human rights abuses from happening. I mean, when you try to simplify it, what has to happen that's reasonable, that's feasible, that could happen in the world that you're dealing with? And is it particular governments that need to act that aren't? Is it civil society actors that aren't? I mean, probably not NGOs, but corporations. Rehan, you talked about sort of a broader critique of global capitalism ultimately, and that interconnection. So where is the point that you see, if something happened there, actually we really could get progress? Rehan, do you want to start? And then.
Yeah, thank you. I'm actually quite happy that you asked us to sort of discuss these two issues together, because I do see some overlaps between North Korea and what's happening against the Uyghur population. One example is the political indoctrination in prison camps, so forced labor is another component of it. Before coming here, I talked to a human rights lawyer in Korea, and he said a lot of people actually don't know what's happening to the Uyghurs, so you have to still explain in South Korea. It's in Japan, the Uyghur issue is much more well known, but South Korea seems to be we still need to raise awareness. And many people do know what's happening in North Korea. And again, as I mentioned, these are components. Like when state wants to control its population, ultimately it comes down to this. State being so paranoid, it's about its legitimacy. It feels very insecure of a population being informed, being intelligent, and being able to voice their concerns about what's happening. Or in the context of the Uyghurs, they see that identity of the population as a threat. Democracies are not afraid of people being informed, and undemocratic countries, authoritarian countries, they use this tools of totalizing its population to suppress and control. And I think that is the overlap. And another thing, Hannah, you mentioned was really struck me, not exactly the same, but similar. Sometimes diplomats would ask me, so what is the latest development in the Uyghur region? Like, tell us the latest development. Well, have we resolved the issue yet to begin with? Has people left the concentration camps? Are the evidence not enough? You know, we have leaked government speeches that came out of China. The maps, we use satellite images to map the concentration camps. We have survivors' account. You know, being a survivor, like, you know, speaking truth to power in Western democracies are not as difficult as speaking truth to power in autocratic countries. That means not only you are at risk, your family who you left behind would be at risk. So we really need to empower those victims. So when people ask these questions, what I try to respond is that in a transparent country, we should be easily able to obtain information. If you're not able to get something out, that is the data. Why? Why it's so difficult to get something out? Why China refused to allow the international community to come in with unfettered access to conduct investigations, right? So how do we go about this then? I think one way is to make sure that we empower really victims. And, you know, you mentioned escapees, survivors. You know, survivors are the fighters. And making sure like their voices are reflected and heard is incredibly important. And the other thing I would say is the credible commitment. Many of people here is scholars of international politics. There is this concept called credible commitment, right, Siri, where like government always say, we care about human rights. We need to impose costs on human rights violators, except they never follow through on that promise. It becomes this empty word, and I could definitely criticize many Western countries for sometimes raising the issue, except you don't follow through. And I think when you lack that credible commitment, the authoritarian governments take that as in some ways sort of implicit consent, or to some extent they see it, there won't be cause, why should I change or modify my behavior? So I really hope that whether it's through diplomatic engagement or including inviting our corporations, different stakeholders to constantly bring up the Uyghur issue, and ultimately we make this as a collective action problem. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question, John. And there is so much that Rayhan mentioned that I think we can really see the connections there. I mean, the fatigue surrounding North Korea, but especially the human rights issue, is very, very real. I was in Geneva in March at the Human Rights Council to do some advocacy related to North Korean human rights issues, and they were like, a very similar response, but what's new? What has changed? Why does this particular issue need more attention than the war that is going on in Ukraine? And then they would also compare it to what's happening with the Uyghur community as well. But human rights violations there's not a hierarchy where one group is suffering more than another. There's unnecessary competition that is happening between governments, between the international community, is something that I think really damages victims' voices and damages survivors to come forward but I need something new, I need something more exciting to show, and then that's where sensationalism happens. And we spoke about fake news as well, where survivors feel that pressure of, unless they have something juicy to engage the community, people will lose interest. And that pressure, I think, is very damaging to the narrative that we're putting out there. Having more of a victim-centered, survivor-centered approach is definitely what needs to happen a lot more. I think what the similarities we see between how we have been able to raise awareness what is happening with the Uyghur community in North Korea is through these displaced communities, those who have left the countries are not in a position to speak out. Yet at the same time, as was already raised, they're speaking out with that fear that they have of potential security issues that might happen to their family in their home countries as well. But I think there's so much, especially with the North Korean escapee community, that we can do. We talk about no information coming in or coming out, but the North Korean escapee community, especially in South Korea, are the drivers they are the bridge between the world and North Korea. Information is perhaps the most powerful agent of change in a country that is so closed off. And even during the pandemic, it was the North Korean escapees that were sending money, information into the country to remind their family members back home that we're here, we're still, your government isn't listening to you, but we are. And I think that the empowerment that we can do for the escapee community is definitely a start. I know Professor Ishihara wants to speak as well, so I'll leave it there. And I think there's more we can speak on in terms of like the corporations and business responsibility, that there's also so much to tie in terms of the forced labor element. But yeah, I'll just put a pin in that for now.
Yeah, let me jump in. Well, when thinking about the Asian government's approach to this issue of freedom, what we have to pay attention is that they claim cultural relativism. They argue that every country, every culture has different approaches, different speed for liberal democracies, and so they should not push human rights agenda to other countries. That tends to be all the Asian governments' arguments. But one thing we have to really pay attention to this argument is that when they make this claim, they are actually looking only at state actors. So their approach is very state-centric. They look at those Malaysian, Singaporean, Indonesian governments who make this Asian values claim. They look at Chinese government who claims that human rights is not about civil liberties, but it's about social rights and economic rights. And those Asian governments think that we should actually let those governments take their time. But if we look at actual cases that Rayhan talked about and also Hannah talked about, and other cases that we care so much, people actually go onto the street taking risks, putting their lives in danger, claiming for freedom. Whether it's in Myanmar, it's in Thailand, or in East Turkestan, Tibet, or Inner Mongolia, wherever it is. In Iran, in Afghanistan, we have been seeing a massive demonstrations in those areas. And that's the actual voice that people are wanting to have, wanting to make. That's the actual culture that we have in Asia. We really have to think about, change the mindset from state-centric approach to more citizens-based or human-based approach in approaching these human rights issues. And so, as both of you were talking about, we do have to empower the citizens who sacrifice their lives to make claims for their, not only for their own sake, but also for their countries, their societies, the entire world, actually. And both the governments, given that those Asian governments are rather reluctant in taking proactive measures, we, the civil society actors, actually have to push the governments and work together with them to support the citizens.
Thank you, Michael. So I will be looking out to the crowd, so just indicate if you have a question, and we'll start to bring you into the conversation. Melly, one question for you, and try to cause a little trouble here between academics, which is what other academics do, but to really twist, I think, some of what Michael was saying. In a way, I heard her initial comment to break down the distinction a bit between democracy and autocracy, as the Biden administration always says, or democracy versus non-democracy, and to sort of say, look, when we look across Asia, there are serious human rights problems in both, and we need to think about both. I know you've done a major study on the region, sort of, and you shared with some of that coming out of the pandemic. But I'm curious if you would, how you wrestle with that question of sort of across Asia. Rehan and Hannah are both focused on an authoritarian and a totalitarian maybe state, but we do have all these semi-democratic or democratic countries with pretty serious problems. And how important do you see the distinction between the type of government or political system? And in terms of solutions, what works in a democracy that's not going to work in an authoritarian state? Although I guess that sounds like a stupid question. But if you find anything interesting in there, please comment.
Well, how do you respond to that question? Because you can really talk about it in different layers. What works in what? What works in providing, in protecting human rights? I think there is the school of thought which says, that is why democracy is the so-called best form of government, because you do have certain norms that you have to abide. There are, and if you are not able to do that, then you do have the opportunity to get that leaders or out of power. You use the rights of citizens to vote. But there are also those who would argue, I'm not talking about the cultural debates here. I think we have passed that debate already. That was there in the 1990s. And there will be some governments who say that even in the West, you have the same. There are some countries that are also have already become more authoritarian, right? But so the question really is, what, to most, if you really want to be practical about it, what form of government will give the most protection to their citizens? And I think if you have a liberal form of government, because then you're able to get the feedback from your citizens, you allow them to be able to complain, so that you, in the process of doing so, you will then sort of check, right? You improve governance, then that's it. But there's also, there's reality out there that even in the most democratic states, certain communities are also deprived of their rights. So what works best? And this is where, if you were at it from a policy perspective, right? We have normative debates, you have the practical debates, right? I think it is important for especially those that are, that are in the, how do you say, that are advocating for protection of human rights, is to find spaces where, right, if you cannot change the government, how then do you best help people? Right? Is it through supporting advocacy groups, working with civil societies, or perhaps working in terms of setting standards for businesses, like what you have done, and for those that some companies have actually stopped or closed factories in places where there's forced labor. So there are multiple interventions, multiple levels working across the board. So to say that democracy is better in providing human rights, the answer is yes. It could also be no, right? And this is it's not just academic, because if you actually see, you have in the United States, the richest country in the world, and yet look at the protection of human rights for those who are victims of gun violence, right? Look at the protection of people of color, right? When they drive across the streets and when a policeman stops them, you don't know whether you're going to be safe. At the height of the pandemic, you had the richest country who could not even provide for basic services, health services to people. And then you had the other extreme. You talk about China, for example, where, okay, in the first perhaps few months of the pandemic, they were able to control it, but at what cost? Right? You talk about 2 years of just locking down, people not being able to move. But they would argue it's okay because we're safe. I don't think some people would agree with that, because 2 years, right? So even there in a so-called repressive states, you do have demonstrations, right? So when you say which works best, which works best to what, right? To give you the kind of life that we all aspire to give us the kind of rights that we want. right? So it's a very complicated question, and I'm sorry, John, to disappoint you. There are no clear and fast answers, right? Because now the world is being divided as to which political and economic model we all want to follow. And these are very serious questions, right? What is the form of system of government that will protect its citizens in all its dimensions, civil and political rights and economic and social-cultural rights? And by the way, just to say that even those governments that say, no, it has to be sequential, it doesn't mean that they are not under pressure, right, from their own citizens. Whether they allow their citizens to have a voice or to influence it is another thing. But because, right, there are those who would say you cannot tell a poor man in the streets who cannot even eat, right, to go and vote when there's no food on the table. And these are real debates that are happening. You cannot ignore that. Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Melanie. That was the opposite of disappointing. You made something interesting of my question, so I appreciate that. I want to draw out, and again, just raise your hand at this point. Students, business people, great. Okay, yeah, let's get the question from the audience. If you could briefly introduce yourself, and if there's anyone in particular you'd like to address your question to.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Kasit Piromya, and I was deciding which session to attend, the 6th, 7th session, but I decided to come here in one of my hats as a board member of the ASEAN Parliamentarian for Human Rights, APHR. And for the past 10, 15 years, we have been working a hell of a lot to promote democracy and defend and promote human rights in Southeast Asian region. And I have a few comments to help you to understand a bit what went on the past few years, why so much of the problem with the COVID-19. I think the first point is that in the Philippines, Malaysia, and Thailand, and even in Myanmar, in each of these countries, democracy is not yet finalized. And there were opposing forces to the semi-authoritarian or military government. So when the COVID-19 came, it did give the opportunity for Duterte, I think Hamid of Malaysia, and my Prime Minister, General Prayut Chan-o-cha, and Senior General Min Aung Hlaing before the coup d'etat and all of this and so on, to revoke to the internal security law and emergency laws and so on, in order to suppress the people because using COVID-19 as an excuse. But there were student movements, opposition forces moving in the Philippines and all of this and so on. So it was an opportune time for the various authoritarian or semi-authoritarian regimes to act accordingly to protect their position and so on. That's the first point.
Second,
sorry to interrupt, but if you could make a quicker point and a question would be great.
My point is to give a comment that unless and until we have more democracy, then we will have these abuses of human rights. I think Mongolia, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan have shown the case, and Singapore, with a sort of some democracy but excellent governance and so on, have shown the way that human rights could be much respected. But definitely not in China, not in Korea, not in Laos, and not in Vietnam, and at the moment not in Cambodia. So unless and until society become democracies, then we do not have to come and complain about the abuses of human rights by the various authorities. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. If there's anyone else, if not, I want to turn back to pull out, was there a hand? Oh yeah, oh great, in front there, Young Dok.
Sorry, I thought, is this going to be like are you going to answer his question first, or are you going to hear all the questions and then
No, if you have a question, please ask, and if you want to direct it to any panelists in particular.
Right. Thank you for the great presentation. I'm from my name is Young Duk Shin from East Asia Foundation. I have two questions. First one is to Dr. Rayhan Assad. It's about the issue of holding great power perpetrators accountable, especially China. Also, it's a very passionate issue, the Uyghur issue. So I understand there's a lot of bottom-up efforts to address the Uyghur human rights violation issue. But I think realistically, there have been a lot of limitations in terms of state actions to address Chinese human rights violations, considering it has such an enormous economic and military power. So my question is, are there any more realistic, effective measures other than economic sanctions? And since the world is now divided more than ever into an authoritarian and democratic camp, so this whole ideological divide, does this structural division does this make the whole Uyghur issue more beneficial or easier to address, or does it exacerbate the issue because since we're getting no cooperation from China? So that's my question for Dr. Assad. And the second question is it's one of the points that Professor Caballero Anthony mentioned. It's about how she mentioned how in a lot of ways, during the COVID crisis, a lot of the human rights violations happened in Western democratic countries in terms of anti-Asian hate crimes, such as in the US and in Western Europe. Have there been any, I'm just curious about your thoughts, just general opinions on how the Asian countries could address this issue more effectively, since there are so many violations on Asian minority groups within Western democratic societies, and I don't think it's that sufficient. I don't think it has been that sufficiently addressed. It has been on the news, but in terms of state approaches, I don't think it has been sufficiently addressed. So I was just wondering about your general thoughts on that issue as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. You just articulated a paradox that we're dealing with at this moment. On the one hand, Uyghur community are victims of the superpower powerful perpetrator you mentioned, because the world is paying more attention to and often are skeptical of great powers, whether it's the United States or China, especially their intentions. I think in a way, it keeps the issue still in the public discourse. Whenever we talk about China, whether it's a military power and other issues, human rights, it does get mentioned in the passing. So in a way, I think it does help a little bit. But at the same time, because China is such a powerful country, it's very difficult to rally different stakeholders around this cause. And one of the main actors is the Hollywood, the entertainment industry, which has been very much vocal when it comes to the genocide in Darfur, from celebrities like Angelina Jolie to Mia Farrow, the film actors like George Clooney, everybody has been so vocal, and I have written about this in an article called "We Need Another Hero." And because a lot of these people, they have business interests, vested interests in maintaining connections and access to China. And that just creates a major problem for us, because very few people, especially those powerful voices, are reluctant to speak up. Elon Musk is seen in China yesterday, and for whatever business interest that he has. Tesla has a major business company, and he talks about this world where he's a big believer in free speech, and yet when it comes to China, he shies away from talking about the human rights issues. So those are the dilemmas are real, and how do we make sure that the Uyghur issue still maintains? Is that I believe in China, despite being very difficult in modifying its behavior, it does still, to some extent, respond to international criticism and international scrutiny. And I hope in the next UN session, we are able to achieve independent commissioning inquiry that we have done for even like North Korea, where we can document human rights issues. And last comment on Asian hate, because that's something that I'm also grappling with. China is weaponizing this to its advantage to say that if you criticize China, then there would be direct link to anti-Asian hate. You know, Uyghurs are also victims of Islamophobia to largest extent too, because often Uyghurs are seen as Muslim too. So racism, it's one, if we are going to talk about racism in one place, we have to talk about racism everywhere. And I always feel like, you know, sometimes Asian communities only talk about the issues facing them without talking about issues that are facing other communities. We cannot be selective in our approach. We have to address racism at its roots and not be selective about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Meli, did you get that question?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did, and it's a very important issue that that really has to be dealt with, and I fear that it is only going to get worse, because as most health experts would say, that we really haven't seen the last of the pandemic, that there could be more of this kind of pandemic. And especially if the pandemic originates from our part of the world, being Asia, then you can imagine how these things could again unleash. How do you address this when even democratic countries, Western governments are also could not even control their own citizens from not just hate speech actually, but even hurting people, right? Violence and all that. And one of the things that I could think of really is the extent to which you really need to be able to, as much as possible, educate people, tell them that, even if the virus comes from that part of the world, it doesn't mean that you're actually a carrier of that virus. A lot of the actions, I guess, if you're walking in the streets and you happen to have, Oriental eyes, then you get hit, right? Regardless of your color, right? It's because there is this so much fake news and misinformation and disinformation about the origins of the virus. And it is only by telling people that, it's not from this part, that they are not carriers, that you could hope, and I use the word hope really, that people will not, will be a bit more, a bit more careful in what they do. So that education, I guess, and that is at all levels. You have to be able to bombard your people. And there was a mention about the importance in times of health emergencies, the importance of making sure that the officials, the government officials, speak to their people and tell them what needs to happen, what is the cause of this, and how do you protect yourself, and so in the process of giving as much information, right? Because that was one of the failures during the crises. Right? Some governments were able to communicate well with their citizens every day. There was something, and then those where the people were left guessing, right? And the governments will just impose certain measures without even preparing their own population that there's going to be a lockdown, that they're going to do this, that they're going to do that. So as much as possible, education and information, and all these things become really, really, really important. I don't know to what extent you can tell your people. I mean, because different settings, different governments do it. But I think you would expect that once there's more information, right, and preparedness in what to do, and making sure that you're also being protected, that the state is actually helping you, protecting you, then you would hope that this thing will be minimized or even stopped. And it is not just the role of governments, really. It's really all other actors, civil society groups as well, I think should be out there helping spread the information. Thank you.
Thanks, Meli. I think we can just get one more. Well, let's get both questions. We have 3 minutes. And let's hear the questions and then any last thoughts in reference to the questions. So if we can get some mics out there. Oh, we already have one. Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentations. What advice can you give to Western governmental policymakers, crystallizing some of the thoughts that you've all very intelligently had about the solutions? And if that's too big a question right now, then very happy to consider having that conversation over dinner later on after this session. But any thoughts you might have on what are the most impactful policy positions Western governments might be able to take to solve some of these seemingly intractable problems?
Okay, give that a thought, your 30-second appetizer version of what Western governments can do. And Dominic?
Hi, I'm Dominic from East Asia Foundation. My question is for Songhana about North Korea, because in North Korea there's like a twin crisis of economic, humanitarian disaster. Like people don't have access to like food and medicine. And through that, the UN and other organizations cooperate with the government to try to improve that situation. But also, there's the political freedom of religion, speech, thought, which often is addressed by trying to punish and isolate the country. So how can we strike a balance between addressing both issues, some that need cooperation with the government and some that need to isolate the government and punish them for their actions?
Great, thank you. Okay, we'll wrap up with these answers. So Hannah, why don't you start?
Great question. Well, I think it goes hand in hand, definitely. I mean, I think I started off with there is no hierarchy when it comes to rights in which one human rights violation is more severe, that we need to prioritize that one first. Although there are definitely civil society groups that would disagree in what we should put forward first, and given that we have very limited avenues to work with North Korea. But when it comes to the prolonged humanitarian crisis that has been going on in North Korea, that has been happening since the Great Famine, what they don't need is more food. What they don't need is just a supply of medicine, but what they need is capacity building and what they can do with that. And I think that kind of ties into the advice we can give to Western governments as well, is when we work with the North Korean government and organizations, how can we embed the human rights values and democratic values that they should be upholding in any type of engagement that we have with North Korea? Unfortunately, the previous South Korean administration really shied away from that, of including any types of human rights dialogue in any engagement that they had with the DPRK. But that sends, a terrible message to governments, not just to North Korea, but also to China, where, you can put that aside if one issue seems to be more important. So when you are doing economic cooperation or humanitarian assistance to North Korea, including civil and political rights is a form that both governments but also international organizations can be taking as well.
Thank you. Michael?
Sure. Thank you very much. Russian aggression into Ukraine, I would say made the discussion about freedom and democracy a bit difficult, in a sense that the aggression and discourse which brought up from the Western side, after then, sort of entangled the issue of democracy and human rights with security, which can be seen from many people in the global South, especially point of view, that the issues of democracy and human rights are state-centered issues, which is about confrontation and war-related. And so I would argue that we actually should detach the issues of freedom and human rights from the Russian aggression, as well as bringing civil society sort of actors into the discussion.
Yeah, Rehan.
It's been very heartening to see a very strong level of commitment to the Ukrainian war, and I hope to see the same level of commitment from Western countries, not only when it threatens its internal security, but it threatens the security of the press group. And let's not prioritize our trade and business relationship with authoritarian governments at the cost of the press. And lastly, I'd forums like Munich Security Forum, human rights advocates don't get invited. Aspen is another forum. But I just want to say, a big shout out to this forum for inviting human rights advocates, lawyers, to be part of this discussion of creating peace and sustainability. Thank you.
Okay, Melly, 30 seconds over there for your advice to Western governments. This is your chance.
Well, I think Western governments and other governments, this is not just a Western agenda, human rights. I want to put that in. I suppose can apply or can think about multiple approaches and different interventions at the state to state and at the state civil society level, and from education to promoting all sorts of programs for capacity building and others. I mean, there's much you can say, and crafting certain policies that are attuned to, and that you also have, I guess, to be a bit more sensitive, and there's a way to perhaps a bit more nuance in the promotion and advocacy of human rights on the basis that everybody wants that agenda, and everybody believes in the agenda of protection and promotion of human rights. Thanks.
Thank you. I hope everyone will join me in, before we thank the panelists, I want to recognize the East Asia Foundation, and my thanks for being included as well as moderator of the event, and for doing a fantastic job in putting all this together. So thank you to the East Asia Foundation, to echo Rehan's tribute to integrating the human rights topic into this conversation and doing it with such deeply knowledgeable and courageous and determined experts and activists. I learned a great deal from this session, and I really thank all four of you for sharing your wisdom, and I hope all of you will join me in giving them a round of applause.